Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you my top 5 books that I read in the fall. If this is one of my first seasonal wrap-ups that you are seeing, let me give you a quick overview of what this video is. After every season is over, I like to look back on that season and I actually rank all the books and put them in order of the ones that I enjoyed the least to the ones that I enjoyed the most. And when I get to my top 5 that I enjoyed the most, I go into a lot more depth about why I enjoyed those books so much. These are some of my favorite videos to make. It's not always easy putting the books in a specific order, but it's always a fun little exercise. I will also link my monthly wrap-ups where I talk about these books down below in case you want to hear more of my thoughts on some of the ones that I don't go in depth on, the ones that don't make it to my top 5. So my fall I considered to be September, October, and November. So those will be the monthly wrap-ups that I link down below. Oh, and I will also have timestamps in the description box for the various parts of this video so you can jump to the parts that you're most interested in seeing. So this year I read 13 books during those months, which is pretty average for me, and I actually had a pretty good reading season quality-wise. I had only one book that I gave 3 stars and no books that I gave 2 stars, which is awesome. I had 8 books that I gave 4 stars, and I had 4 books that I gave 5 stars. So I am really happy with my ratings and the quality, or like how much I enjoyed what I was reading over the fall. I also didn't have any rereads in the fall. I'm not a huge rereader to begin with, but I always mention my rereads because I usually pull them out of the rankings and I don't include them in my top 5. But I didn't have any rereads in the fall, so it doesn't really matter this time. So now I'm going to go over the books that I read in the order from least to most enjoyed. The one book that I read in the fall that I gave 3 stars was Beautiful by Juliet Marillier. And then moving on to my 4-star books, honestly, these were really hard to rank. I had 8 4-star books, one of which I had to select to be in my top 5, and even with the other 7 of them, some of them were so close in enjoyment that it was really hard for me to put them in an order, but I did the best I could. At the bottom of my 4 stars, I have Fledgling by Octavia Butler, followed by Teeth in the Mist by Dawn Kurtagich, then The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong, and then Dawn Shard by Brandon Sanderson, and Edge Dancer by Brandon Sanderson. I did enjoy Edge Dancer just a little bit more than Dawn Shard. I actually am a fan of the character Lift, unlike a lot of other people. Then I have Artificial Condition by Martha Wells, one of the Murderbot Diaries, followed by Kilman Creek by Rachel Kane. And that brings me to my top 5. So the one 4-star book that made it into my top 5, and like I said, it was definitely not easy to pick which of my 4 stars I wanted to include in my top 5, but I settled on Fablehaven by Brandon Mull, which is the first book in the Fablehaven series. This is actually a middle grade, which is not a age category that I read from often. I used to read a lot more middle grade when I was like in my early 20s. I really do enjoy middle grade, but I don't know, for some reason since starting my channel, I just haven't picked it up that much, and I'm always saying that I want to read more middle grade, and I really wanted to read this series, and so I finally got around to it this year, and I enjoyed Fablehaven so much. I read this book when I was kind of going through some rough stuff in my life, and I kind of needed a break from some of the adult high fantasy that I was reading. I needed something that was kind of like a pick-me-up, a palate cleanser, and I thought it was the perfect time to read Fablehaven, and it really hit the spot right when I needed it. So this series is about 2 siblings, and they have to go spend some time with their grandfather, who they don't know very well because their grandfather or the grandparents have always been really busy and haven't had time to spend a lot of time with them, but for family reasons they have to go spend some time at their grandparents' house, only to find out that their grandparents are caretakers of this haven for magical creatures. It's like a preservation where magical creatures live to be protected from like the rest of the world, and adventures ensue from there. I really enjoyed the dynamic between the 2 siblings. The older one is a sister or a girl, and the younger one is a little brother, and he definitely plays like the annoying little brother character, and the sister the older sister is like really smart and always follows the rules sort of thing. So I just really enjoyed their little dynamic, but I also really enjoyed the adults in this book. There were a lot of things in this book that I felt like were like nods to adults or like jokes that adults would find more funny than kids, and I always love it when middle grade books do that because it just makes it more enjoyable to read as an adult. And there are also just like a lot of really good messages and morals like there are in a lot of middle grade books, and it made my heart happy. I had a lot of fun reading it. I laughed out loud multiple times. I got teary-eyed a couple of times too because there were a couple of sad things that happened. And I just think the world is really interesting. And there were some like overarching like plot threads that were sprinkled in that I know will continue on through the rest of the series that I'm very interested in seeing where those plot threads go. So I will definitely be continuing on in the series in 2021. Okay, moving on to my 5-star reads. At the bottom of my 5-star reads, I have Thunderhead by Neal Shusterman, which is the second book in the Arc of the Scyth series. I have really enjoyed the Arc of the Scyth series so far. I still need to read the third book, definitely happening soon. I guess not before 2020 is over, but hopefully in early 2021. I really enjoy the world of the Arc of the Scythe series. So if you don't know, this is set in a future kind of utopian, dystopian world where there's this AI called the Thunderhead that has basically solved all of the world's problems. There's no hunger, no sickness, no death, basically. And so there are these people whose job it is, they're called Scyths, to go around and choose people to die because it's like the only way to prevent overpopulation. And I just really love the ideas explored in this book and the way morality is explored. The Scyths were definitely not what I expected based on what I had heard about them when people talk about the series. This second installment in the series, I will say, like, for part of it was a bit slower. The pacing was slower. It was not really going in a direction that I was expecting, but it still held my interest. I still enjoy the main characters' POVs. And we also get a lot more introspection into the AI, the Thunderhead, which I found fascinating. And then the end of the book, though, it definitely picks up pace towards the end and some crazy things happened. It ends on kind of a cliffhanger, like just some crazy stuff happened at the end that I was not expecting. That's what pushed it from like a 4-star to a 5-star, because I can't say that I absolutely loved the first half of the book, but the ending was so good and it definitely has me dying to know what's going to happen in the next book. Okay, moving on to my next 5-star read. These last 3, man, they were so good. They're all my favorites. I had a really hard time putting them in an order. And some of you guys might be surprised about what ends up being like my #1 book. I know I was kind of surprised by it, but I really think it was my favorite. But anyways, my third favorite book that I read in the fall was Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 3rd book in the Stormlight Archive series. If you are somehow unfamiliar with the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson, it is an adult high fantasy series, and I have been marathoning my way through the series because the 4th book came out in November and I wanted to read it right when it came out, which I did. I just didn't finish it in November, so that one gets included in my winter reads later on. I did, however, read 2 Stormlight Archive books over these 3 months, and this is the one, Oathbringer was the one that I enjoyed slightly less than the other one, which I will talk about later in this video. Oathbringer just had a lot more, like, I wouldn't say pacing issues, but the pacing was a lot slower. There was a lot of world building happening, which I really appreciate Sanderson's world building. I'm a sucker for like intricate, interesting, fancy world building, and that's a lot of what Sanderson does. And so I did enjoy the world building aspects of Oathbringer, but just like the pacing was a little bit slower. At the same time, I still really enjoy all of the characters in the series, and I love spending time with them, so I still gave this book 5 stars. But just compared to the other Stormlight Archive book that I read in the fall, I didn't enjoy it quite as much. The other one had a little more action. With Oathbringer being a 3rd book in a series, I feel like I can't say too much about it. You can definitely check out my wrap-up where I talk about it, but also if you have already read Oathbringer, I have a bunch of book diaries, which are just like really spoilery reading vlogs that cover each of the 5 parts of Oathbringer, so definitely go check those out if you are like a super fan of Stormlight Archives and want to know like really in-depth spoilery thoughts. That's where I would point you to. Okay, so that brings me to my second favorite book that I read in the fall, and that is going to be the other Stormlight Archive book that I read, which was Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, and this is the second book in the Stormlight Archives. So yes, I enjoyed the second book in the series slightly more than I enjoyed the third book in the series. Words of Radiance just had a lot more action and a lot more moments where I was like, yes! And just like really excited about what was happening. Some really quotable moments, some just like really exciting things, and things that had to do with some of my favorite characters. I really had a good time reading Words of Radiance. It is, at this time, my second favorite Stormlight Archives book, because the newest one that came out, Rhythm of War, is now my first favorite Stormlight Archives book. But before I read Rhythm of War, Words of Radiance was my favorite Stormlight Archives book. I also have some book diaries for Words of Radiance. I started doing my book diaries about halfway through Words of Radiance, so I have them for part 3, part 4, and part 5. So if you have already read the book and want to know what some of my favorite scenes were and what some of my reactions were, definitely go check those out. But I don't think I have a whole lot more to say about it other than I really enjoyed it. I had such a good time reading it. I got a little teary-eyed at the end. I also got teary-eyed in Oathbringer too, but I don't think it was until Rhythm of War that any Stormlight Archive book actually made me cry, but I keep bringing up Rhythm of War, but I can't talk about it in this video. But yeah, Words of Radiance was my second favorite book that I read in the fall, which might be a little bit of a surprise because I loved the Stormlight Archives so much, and I love both of these so much, that it's like, what is the other book that made it to my #1 spot? Like I said, these top 3 books were all really close. It was very hard to put them in an order. But I decided that my favorite book that I read in the fall was The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, which is an adult contemporary fantasy. And let me tell you, that is not what I was expecting. I would have never guessed that this book would have beat out any Stormlight Archive books before I read it. And honestly, it's so different from the Stormlight Archives books that it's really hard to compare. But there's just something about this book. It gave me the warm fuzzies. It made my heart so happy. I really loved it. And so, I don't know, it stole my heart. I'm putting it in my #1 spot. There has definitely been a lot of buzz about this book, and I was a little skeptical about it because it didn't sound like it was something that was up my alley. It's a contemporary fantasy, which I don't always love. Basically, it's about a man who is a social worker for kids with magical abilities. So in this world, magic exists, there are magical children, and many of them live in orphanages, and he goes around checking in on these orphanages and making sure that the kids are being well cared for and like doing reports and things. And the world is definitely a little bit whimsical. I think a good example of that is the fact that his bosses in this like government entity that he works for are called extremely upper management, which every time I read that, I had a little giggle because I thought it was so funny. His job is to visit a bunch of orphanages, and towards the beginning of the book, he gets like a special assignment to go spend like a month at this special orphanage that he isn't told very much about before he goes. He just knows that it's like a top secret thing. And so he goes there and spends a month with these kids and their caretakers, and the story kind of goes from there. All of this does not sound like something I would be particularly interested in, especially when you add in kind of like the whimsical element. I like reading more like serious things usually. So when I hear the word whimsical, I don't usually think I'm going to like it. But this book, people often described it as like a warm hug, and I didn't really know what that meant until I read it, but now I totally agree. It's just like a really cozy book, which is another word that I would not usually think, like when you describe a book as cozy, I wouldn't think that that would be up my alley. So trust me when I say I was really surprised at how much I enjoyed this book. I love all of the characters in this book. The kid characters were just adorable and so funny and so sweet. And there's just so many great messages in this book. I did listen to the audiobook of this, which was at the time available on Scribd, and I highly recommend the audiobook. The narrator was fantastic and gave people such interesting voices, especially some of the kids' voices. But the book just has so many good messages about like not judging people for what they seem to be on the surface, and learning to embrace your true self, and like questioning things that like have always been a certain way, but that might not necessarily mean that's like the right way that things should be. I don't know if that even makes sense, but there's just, the book had so many good messages. I've heard people describe this book as being middle grade for adults, and I totally agree with that as well. It's definitely geared towards adults because the main character is an adult, and some of the themes are a little bit more mature, I think, but at the same time it feels like a middle grade because of this whole like whimsical, cozy part of it, and it has all these like good messages like what you see when you read middle grade. I don't know, guys, this book really left an impression on me, and I think part of it is that it surprised me. Like Stormlight Archives, I knew that I was gonna love those books. This one, I wasn't really sure, but I ended up loving it so much that I had to give it my #1 spot. I know there's a lot of buzz and hype about this book, and I'm usually really hesitant to kind of add to books that are really hyped, but I really think that this is a book a lot of people will enjoy. So if you've been considering reading it, if you need a bit of a pick-me-up or a palate cleanser, I definitely recommend this one. It's not a book that has a bunch of like twists and turns and action and things like that, but it's just like a cozy, happy read that will put a smile on your face and give you a hug. Alright guys, those are all the things that I read in the fall and which ones were my favorite out of the things that I read. Let me know down in the comment section if you have read any of these books and you have thoughts on the things that I said, or let me know what was your favorite book that you read in the fall. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.